Lost letter. I can still smell the rosemary in your hair. This letter was discovered in 1894 during renovation of a house in Cheapside, London. Found sealed inside a physician's leather satchel hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been an apothecary shop, the letter was written on good quality paper with iron gall ink that had faded to sepia. The envelope was addressed to Mistress Elizabeth Whitmore, care of Master Thomas Whitmore, Henley upon Thames, Oxfordshire, but was never posted. The 15th day of August, in the year of our Lord, 1665. London. My dearest Elizabeth, I can still smell the rosemary in your hair. 'Tis a strange thing to write when the very air around me reeks of death and burning pitch, when every breath I draw carries the stench of bodies left too long in shuttered houses and lime scattered thick over graves that cannot be dug fast enough. But it is true, my love. In the midst of this pestilence that has turned our fair city into something from Revelations itself, the memory of your sweet scent sustains me more than food or drink or even prayer. Do you remember that morning, just before you left for your uncle's house in Oxfordshire? You had been gathering herbs in Mrs. Pemberton's garden behind the shop, filling your basket with rosemary and lavender and thyme, all the sweet-smelling plants that folk believe might ward off the corruption of the air. The morning sun caught in your dark hair as you worked, and when I came upon you there among the plants, you looked up and smiled, and the fragrance of crushed rosemary clung to your fingers as you touched my face. For protection, you said, tucking a sprig into my doublet. The old wives say rosemary remembers, that it holds fast to what is dear and will not let it be forgotten. How prophetic those words seem now, my darling, for indeed the rosemary remembers. When all else in this accursed city speaks of endings and despair, the memory of that herb's clean scent in your hair reminds me that somewhere beyond this plague-stricken place, life continues. Somewhere you wake each morning to bird song instead of the tolling of church bells, breathe air that smells of fields and flowers instead of funeral smoke. It has been 3 months since you departed with your father on that wagon piled high with household goods. 3 months since I watched you disappear into the crowd of other refugees fleeing London's contagion. 3 months since I made the choice to remain here among the sick and dying, to practice the healing arts my master taught me, even as the pestilence makes a mockery of all our learning. You wept when I told you I could not come with you, could not abandon the people who needed whatever poor skill I possess. What good will you do, you asked, if you die of this sickness yourself? What purpose is served by such sacrifice? I had no ready answer then, and I confess I have less of one now. The plague takes whom it will, the young and old, the virtuous and the wicked, those who follow every precaution and those who live as if death were not stalking the very streets. I have seen infants die in their mothers' arms while drunkards in the alehouses remain untouched. I have watched learned physicians succumb to the pestilence they sought to cure, while ignorant quacks who prescribe nothing but prayers and purges continue to prosper. What logic governs such choices? What divine plan can account for such seeming randomness? I no longer pretend to know, my love. I only know that I wake each morning and take up my satchel and make my rounds among the afflicted, not because I believe I can conquer this disease, but because to do otherwise would be to surrender the last vestiges of what makes us human in the face of inhuman suffering. The city you knew is gone. Elizabeth, In its place stands something from a fever dream, a landscape so changed that I sometimes wonder if I have not died and found myself in some peculiar corner of purgatory. The streets that once rang with the cries of merchants and the laughter of children now echo only with the wheels of death carts and the prayers of searchers seeking new victims of the pestilence. Where once every doorway bustled with commerce and conversation, now half the houses bear the dreaded red cross and the inscription, "Lord, have mercy upon us," painted in letters that seem to bleed in the morning light. The shuttered windows stare like blind eyes, and behind them lie families struck down so swiftly that neighbors found them days later, the living and the dead huddled together in their final extremity. Do you remember Goodwife Fletcher, who kept the pie shop on Bread Street? She who always saved you the choicest meat pasties and called you her sweet rosebud with such maternal fondness. I found her 3 days ago, sitting in her chair as if she had merely dozed off while tending her ovens. The pestilence had taken her so gently that her face wore an expression of perfect peace, as if she had simply decided to rest for a moment before returning to her work. But her 3 grandchildren, who had been staying with her while their parents visited the country, were not granted such merciful ends. I will not burden you with the details of their suffering, my love. Some sights are too terrible to set down in words, too monstrous to carry across the miles to disturb your peace. Let it suffice to say that I arranged for their burial with as much dignity as these times allow, and I said prayers over their small graves, though I confess my faith in the power of such words grows thin. The worst of it is the silence, Elizabeth, not the silence of death, for death, oddly, is often quite noisy, full of groaning and weeping and the frantic activity of the living trying to tend the dying. No, I speak of the deeper silence that has settled over London like a shroud, the absence of all the sounds that once made this city feel alive. No more do we hear the bells of vendors crying their wares, for there are too few customers to make such commerce worthwhile. No more do children play in the streets, for parents keep those who survive locked safely behind doors, as if love alone could bar the pestilence from their homes. Even the church bells, which once marked the passing hours with such faithful regularity, now toll only for the dead, and that so constantly that many parishes have given up the practice altogether, lest the sound drive the living to despair. In this unnatural quiet, I find my thoughts turning ever more frequently to you, to the music your presence brought to my days. I remember your laughter, not the polite, measured mirth that ladies are taught to display in company, but the genuine, joyful sound you made when something truly delighted you. I remember the way you hummed while you worked, little melodies that seemed to spring from some secret wellspring of happiness within your heart. Most of all, I remember your voice speaking my name, not Master Thornfield, as propriety demanded in public, but simply Thomas, in that soft, warm tone you used when we were alone together. You made my common name sound like music, like a prayer, like something precious rather than merely the designation my parents happened to choose. God's truth, Elizabeth, there are moments when I would trade all my knowledge of physic, all my skill with herbs and bloodletting and the setting of bones, just to hear you speak my name once more in that beloved voice. But I am being maudlin, and that serves neither of us well. Let me tell you, instead of the small victories, the tiny victories that keep hope alive in this charnel house our city has become. Yesterday, I delivered a woman of her first child, a perfect, healthy boy who entered this world crying lustily, as if to announce that life will not be defeated by death, no matter how terrible its current dominion. The mother, poor soul, had been abandoned by her husband when the first symptoms of the pestilence appeared in their neighborhood. He fled to his family in Kent, leaving her to face her confinement alone. But her labor was swift and clean, and when I placed that squalling infant in her arms, her face lit with such radiant joy that for a moment the very air seemed cleaner, the shadows less dark. "He shall be called Hope," she told me, tears streaming down her cheeks, "for he has brought hope back into the world." I helped her to a lying-in house run by a group of widows who have turned their own loss into service to others. These good women have lost husbands, children, entire families to the pestilence, yet they continue to provide care and comfort to those who have nowhere else to turn. They are proof, if proof were needed, that human goodness can flourish even in the darkest soil. There are others like them throughout the city, physicians who treat the poor without payment, merchants who distribute food to the hungry, clergy who tend the dying without regard for their own safety. Not many, perhaps, but enough to remind us that courage and compassion have not entirely fled this afflicted place. I think of these folk when despair threatens to overwhelm me, when the weight of suffering I witness each day seems too great to bear. I think of them, and I think of you, and I find strength to continue. Your letters have been my greatest comfort in these dark times. Each one arrives like a gift from paradise, carrying news of clean air and growing things, of your uncle's household where children still play and flowers still bloom and gardens tended by living hands. When I read your descriptions of morning walks through meadows where larks sing and afternoon hours spent reading beneath apple trees heavy with fruit, I can almost believe that such a world still exists somewhere. You write that you dream of returning to London when this pestilence passes, of resuming the life we had planned together. My dearest girl, I pray daily that such dreams may come to pass, but I must confess that I no longer recognize the city that shaped us both. The London we knew, the London where we met and courted and fell in love, exists now only in memory, as distant as if it belonged to another century. Even should I survive this trial, even should the pestilence run its course and the streets once again fill with the living, I fear I shall not be the same man who bid you farewell that terrible morning in May. I have seen too much, lost too much, learned too much about the fragility of all we hold dear. The young physician who believed his skills could triumph over any malady, who saw death as an enemy to be defeated rather than a mystery to be accepted, that man died somewhere in the shuttered houses of Cheapside, somewhere among the plague pits of Aldgate. In his place stands someone older, sadder, perhaps wiser, but certainly more aware of his own limitations. This man understands that healing is not conquest, but compassion, that the greatest service we can offer the dying is not false hope, but faithful presence. He has learned that love is not a prize to be won or a pleasure to be grasped, but a grace that transforms both giver and receiver, making us larger than our separate selves. Would you still love such a man, Elizabeth? Would you still wish to bind your life to someone who has walked so long among shadows, who has breathed the air of charnel houses and held the hands of the dying until their fingers grew cold? I do not ask these questions to wound you, but because I would not have you return to London expecting to find unchanged the man you remember. The summer draws to its close, and with it, God willing, the worst of this pestilence. Already there are fewer new cases in some parishes, fewer red crosses painted on doors that yesterday stood unmarked. The death carts make their rounds less frequently, and occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, one hears laughter from behind shuttered windows, the sound of survivors discovering that life, against all odds, continues. Perhaps by the time autumn arrives it will be safe for you to return. Perhaps we shall walk again through streets that smell of baking bread instead of burning bodies, see children playing where now only rats and carrion birds hold dominion. Perhaps we shall sit once more in Mrs. Pemberton's garden and breathe the scent of rosemary and lavender while planning a future that extends beyond the next sunrise. But whether that blessed day comes soon or late, whether I live to see it or perish in service to this dying city, know this, my beloved Elizabeth. Every morning when I wake to face another day of suffering and loss, it is the memory of rosemary in your hair that gives me strength to rise. Every evening when I return to my chambers, exhausted in body and spirit, it is the hope of holding you again that allows me to find rest. You are my rosemary, my love, the herb that remembers, that holds fast to what is precious and will not let it be forgotten. No pestilence can touch that memory, no death can diminish that love. It lives in me as surely as breath lives in my lungs, as blood flows in my veins. The candle burns low, and I must finish this letter that may never reach you, these words that may never be read by the eyes for which they are intended. But perhaps that matters less than the writing of them. Perhaps love itself is justified by its own expression, regardless of whether it finds its intended mark. If fate ordains that we never meet again in this world, that this pestilence claims me as it has claimed so many others, remember me as I was when we walked together through London's busy streets, when the future stretched before us, bright with possibility. Remember the young man who loved you with a heart unmarked by tragedy, who saw in your smile the promise of joy unlimited. But if God in His mercy spares me for reunion, if the plague passes and the city lives again, then I shall come to you in Oxfordshire with hands that have learned to heal through suffering, with a heart that has discovered love's true depth through loss, with a spirit that has been tested in the fire and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least unbroken. And when that day comes, when at last I take you once again in my arms, I shall breathe deep the scent of rosemary in your hair, and I shall know that I have come home at last to the only paradise that matters, the heaven we create when two souls choose to love despite a world that teaches us daily how easily all we cherish can be destroyed. Until that blessed hour, I remain your devoted servant, your faithful lover, your Thomas, who counts each sunrise as one day closer to the end of this separation and the beginning of whatever life awaits us beyond this valley of shadows. I have enclosed in this letter a sprig of rosemary from Mrs. Pemberton's garden, the same plant from which you gathered herbs that last morning we spent together. The garden grows wild now, tended by no human hand, but the rosemary flourishes still, its scent as sweet and strong as ever. Keep it with you as a token of my love that endures, as a promise that some things survive even the worst that this world can offer, as a symbol of the hope that carries me through each dark day toward the dawn of our reunion. With all my love and all my longing, Thomas Thornfield. This letter was discovered along with a dried sprig of rosemary, still faintly fragrant after more than 2 centuries. According to parish records, Thomas Thornfield, aged 26, physician and surgeon, died of plague on September 3, 1665, 2 weeks after writing this letter. Elizabeth Whitmore never returned to London. The apothecary shop where the letter was found had belonged to Master William Pemberton, who died with his wife and 2 apprentices during the Great Plague. The building stood empty for 3 years before being converted to other use. Records show that Elizabeth Whitmore married a yeoman farmer in Oxfordshire in 1668 and bore 6 children. She lived to the age of 82 and was buried in the churchyard at Henley-upon-Thames. In her will, she left instructions for rosemary to be planted on her grave in memory of love that death could not conquer. Lost letter. God's wrath has red crosses on every door. This letter was discovered in 1953 during restoration of St. Bartholomew's Church in London, found sealed within a false bottom of a wooden chest in the vestry. The letter was written on foolscap paper with fading brown ink. The envelope was addressed to Master Nathaniel Blackwood, care of Master John Hartwell, Ashford, Kent, but was never posted. In the year of our Lord, 1666, Parish, London. My beloved son, Nathaniel, God's wrath has red crosses on every door, and I no longer understand his ways. I write these words by candlelight in the vestry of our church, surrounded by the ledgers where I once recorded baptisms and marriages with such joy, such certainty in the Lord's providence. Now these same pages are filled with nothing but burials, column after column of names, ages, dates of death, until the ink blurs before my eyes and the very act of writing becomes a catalogue of divine judgment I cannot comprehend. 73 souls this week alone, my son. 73 members of my flock gathered unto the Lord in the space of 7 days, while I stand helpless in my pulpit, speaking words that taste like ashes in my mouth, offering comfort I no longer feel in my own heart. You ask in your last letter why I do not come to Kent, why I persist in remaining in this city of death, when your Uncle John has offered sanctuary in his country house. Surely, you write with the confidence of youth untested by such trials, the Lord would not fault a minister for preserving his life to serve him in better times. But I cannot leave Nathaniel, not because I believe my presence here serves any divine purpose. God knows I have begun to doubt whether anything I do serves any purpose at all, but because I have become like a man possessed by questions that will not release their hold upon my soul. How does a righteous God choose his victims? By what celestial logic does the plague take goodwife Ames, who gave her last farthing to feed the poor, while it spares Master Cromwell, who cheats his tenants and beats his servants? Why does it claim little Sarah Fletcher, who knew nothing but innocence and love, while it passes by Thomas Ragg, who deals in false weights and waters his ale? I have wrestled with these questions through sleepless nights, sought answers in Scripture until my eyes burn and my head aches, prayed until my knees are raw from kneeling on these stone floors, yet still The red crosses multiply on our doors like spots of blood. Still the death carts rumble through streets that echo with the cries of the bereaved. Still the graveyards overflow with bodies that receive no proper service because there are too many dead and too few living to mourn them. Yesterday I buried the Whitmore family, all 7 of them, from old Master Whitmore down to the babe who had not yet learned to walk. They were found in their house by the searchers, arranged as if for prayer, the father's arms around his wife, the children gathered close as if love itself might shield them from the pestilence. It did not. I spoke the customary words over their common grave, recited the familiar passages about dust returning to dust and the resurrection of the faithful. But as I watched the grave diggers shovel earth over the plain wooden box that held an entire family, I wondered if I was speaking truth or merely parroting comfortable lies we tell ourselves to make death bearable. The truth, if I dare name it, is that I am losing my faith like a man loses blood from a wound. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, until I fear I shall soon be empty of everything I once held sacred. Do you remember, my son, how we used to walk together through the streets of London when you were but a boy? How I would point to the spires of churches and speak of them as fingers pointing toward heaven? How I would describe this great city as a beacon of godliness, shining in a world of darkness? Now those same spires seem to me like accusations thrust against an empty sky, and this city has become a charnel house, where the very air carries the stench of divine abandonment. I have tried to understand this pestilence as a test of faith, as a refining fire meant to purify the souls of the elect. But if that were so, should not the truly righteous be spared while only the wicked perish? Should not innocence provide some protection against the destroyer? Instead, I see the reverse. The wealthy flee to their country estates while the poor remain to die. The strong abandon the weak. The healthy shun the sick. If this be God's judgment, it falls most heavily upon those who can least bear it, least deserve it, least understand why they must suffer for sins they never knew they committed. Perhaps you think your father has grown morbid, dwelling overmuch on dark thoughts while neglecting the comfort that faith should provide. But I cannot pretend to certainties I no longer possess, cannot offer hope I do not feel, cannot speak of divine love when all around me I see evidence of divine indifference. The red crosses painted on afflicted houses have become symbols of something far more troubling than mere contagion. They mark not just the presence of disease, but the failure of every comforting doctrine I have preached, every reassuring promise I have made about God's special care for His chosen people. When I see those crosses, crude, hurried marks painted in pig's blood or red ochre, I no longer think of salvation, but of sacrifice, not of divine protection, but of divine wrath unleashed without distinction upon the just and unjust alike. They remind me not of Christ's passion, but of the blood of the Passover lamb, except that in this plague there seems to be no house so marked that the angel of death passes by. I think often of Job in these dark hours, that righteous man who lost everything through no fault of his own, whose friends insisted his suffering must be punishment for hidden sins. But even Job maintained his faith in the ultimate justice of the Almighty, even in his extremity proclaimed that though God slay him, yet would he trust in him. I confess, my son, that I lack Job's steadfastness. When I see the red crosses multiplying like a pox upon our streets, when I smell the smoke from the great fires where they burn the bedding and clothing of the dead, when I hear the constant tolling of church bells until the very sound becomes a mockery of mourning, I find myself questioning not just God's methods, but His mercy, not just His timing, but His very nature. Is it possible that we have misunderstood everything, that the God we worship is not the loving Father we imagined, but something far more terrible, far more alien to human understanding? Or worse still, is it possible that there is no God at all, that we have been praying to an empty sky while disease and death operate according to their own mindless laws? These are the thoughts that torment me in the watches of the night, the doubts that poison every prayer I attempt to offer. They are thoughts unfit for a minister of the gospel, unworthy of one called to shepherd the Lord's flock. Yet I cannot banish them, cannot return to the simple certainties that once sustained me. I remember the morning you left for Kent, how you knelt for my blessing in this very vestry where I now write. Your face was so earnest, so full of trust in your Father's wisdom and your Father in heaven's protection. You spoke of your calling to the ministry, of your desire to follow in my footsteps and serve the Lord as I had served Him. I want to bring the same comfort to troubled souls that you have brought, Father, you said. I want to help people find God's love even in the darkest times. How proud I was in that moment, how certain that I was sending you forth as a worthy vessel of divine grace. Now I wonder if I have not done you a disservice, filling your young mind with beliefs that may prove as fragile as mine have proven when tested by true adversity. What comfort can I offer to troubled souls when I myself am troubled beyond measure? What assurance can I give of God's love when I have begun to doubt whether love governs this universe at all? How can I speak of divine providence when all around me I see evidence of cosmic indifference? Yet still I go through the motions of ministry. Still I visit the sick and comfort the dying. Still I conduct what services are possible in a city where many churches stand empty and many priests have fled, not from faith, but from habit, not from conviction, but from the hope that if I continue to act as if I believe, perhaps belief itself will return. There is a strange comfort in ritual, my son, even when the ritual has been drained of meaning. The familiar words of Scripture, the ancient prayers, the time-honored responses, they create a framework of normalcy in a world gone mad, a pretense of order in the midst of chaos. When I stand before the few congregants brave enough to attend service, when I open the prayer book and begin the familiar liturgy, for brief moments I can almost remember what it felt like to believe those words carried weight, to trust that our voices joined in worship might actually reach the throne of grace. Almost, but not quite. The doubt remains, like a canker eating at the heart of faith, like a worm in the fruit of certainty. I think sometimes of the early Christians, how they faced persecution and death with songs of praise upon their lips, how they went to martyrdom joyfully because they were certain of the crown of glory awaiting them. What faith they must have possessed, what unshakable conviction that their suffering served a divine purpose. But those martyrs chose their fate, embraced it willingly for the sake of conscience and truth. The victims of this plague have no such choice, no such consolation. They die not as heroes of faith, but as casualties of circumstance, struck down, by a disease that recognizes no distinction between saint and sinner, believer and infidel. Where is the glory in such death? Where is the divine justice in such indiscriminate slaughter? Where is the loving God who numbers the very hairs upon our heads and notes the fall of every sparrow? I have searched the Scriptures for answers, reading until my eyes water and my head pounds. I have found prophecies of judgment and promises of restoration, threats of wrath and assurances of mercy, but nothing that explains why a righteous God would allow such senseless suffering to fall upon His people. Perhaps the fault lies not in God, but in my own understanding. Perhaps mortal minds are simply too limited to comprehend the workings of infinite wisdom. Perhaps what appears to me as meaningless cruelty is actually part of some vast design too grand for human perception. But if that is so, then what purpose does faith serve? If God's ways are so far beyond our understanding that apparent evil might be hidden good, then how can we ever trust our own moral judgments? How can we distinguish between righteousness and wickedness if the outcomes are identical? These questions circle endlessly in my mind like carrion birds over a battlefield, feeding on the corpse of my former certainty. I have become like Thomas in the upper room, demanding to see the wounds before I will believe, except that the wounds I see around me seem to argue against rather than for the resurrection. I do not write these things to burden you with my doubts, my beloved son, nor to shake the foundations of your own faith. Perhaps your generation will find answers that have eluded mine. Perhaps in the countryside where you dwell, surrounded by the beauty of God's creation and the simple faith of country folk, these urban sophistries will seem like the barren speculations they may well be. Hold fast to your calling, Nathaniel. Serve the Lord with gladness if you can. Comfort the afflicted with whatever truth you find in Scripture and prayer. But remember that faith built on easy certainties may crumble when faced with hard realities. Build your foundation not on the shifting sands of human understanding, but on the solid rock of divine love, even when that love seems hidden beneath layers of apparent cruelty. I pray, though I confess I no longer know to whom I pray or whether anyone hears, that this pestilence will soon run its course, that the red crosses will fade from our doors, that life will return to streets now haunted by death. I pray that when you are ordained to the ministry, you will inherit a world where faith makes sense again, where the goodness of God is evident in the welfare of His people. But if you do not, if you too must shepherd a flock through valleys of shadow and doubt, remember your Father's struggles and do not judge yourself too harshly if certainty eludes you. Perhaps the greatest faith is that which persists not because it understands, but because it hopes, not because it sees clearly, but because it refuses to be blinded by present darkness. The candle burns low, and dawn approaches with its daily burden of fresh sorrows. Soon I must make my rounds among the afflicted, speak words of comfort I do not feel, offer prayers I am no longer certain are heard. I will look upon the red crosses that multiply like a plague of their own upon our doors, and I will try to see in them not signs of divine wrath, but symbols of human suffering that calls out for compassion rather than explanation. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps in a world where God's purposes remain hidden, the highest calling is not to understand, but to care, not to explain, but to love, not to justify the ways of providence, but to alleviate the pain of those who suffer under them. If I have lost my faith, my son, at least let me not lose my humanity. If I can no longer believe in the perfect justice of heaven, at least let me work for the imperfect justice of earth. If the red crosses on our doors mark nothing more than the random cruelty of nature, at least let them also mark the places where love refused to abandon hope, where compassion persisted despite the absence of understanding. Write to me when you can, my beloved boy. Tell me of green fields and clear skies, of simple faith and honest doubt, of the God you serve in the innocence of youth. Perhaps your letters will help me remember why I once believed, why I still hope to believe again. Until that blessed day of reunion, either in this world or the next, I remain your devoted father, wrestling with angels in the darkness and praying for dawn, with all my love and what remains of my hope. Your father, Reverend Samuel Blackwood. This letter was discovered following the restoration of St. Bartholomew's Church, which survived both the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. According to parish records, Reverend Samuel Blackwood died on September 4th, 1666, while helping to fight the fire that eventually cleansed much of medieval London. His body was found in the ruins of a house where he had been helping to evacuate a family. Nathaniel Blackwood was ordained as a minister in 1668 and served parishes in Kent for 43 years. He never married, dedicating his life to ministry among the poor. In his own surviving letters, he wrote frequently about his father's courage during the plague years and credited him with teaching that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to serve despite doubt. The church registry shows that Reverend Blackwood conducted 847 burial services during the plague year of 1665 to 1666, more than any other minister in London. A memorial plaque installed in 1966 reads, "He questioned God, but never abandoned his people." Lost letter. The bells have stopped ringing for the dead. This letter was discovered in 1952 during demolition of a row of Tudor houses in Bishopsgate, London. Found wrapped in oiled cloth inside a wall cavity, the letter was written on heavy paper with iron gall ink that had turned dark brown with age. The envelope was addressed to Mistress Dorothy Ashford, the White Hart Inn, Chelmsford, Essex, but was never posted. The 20th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1666. London. My dearest sister Dorothy, the bells have stopped ringing for the dead, and I think it may be because there is no one left to ring them. 'Tis a strange thing to write, but truer than I wish it were. All through the long months of this pestilence, the church bells tolled day and night for the departed souls, sometimes so constantly that one could scarce hear oneself think for the morning bronze that filled the air like thunder. We complained of it. Those of us who still lived said it was driving us to madness with its endless reminders of mortality. But now that the ringing has ceased, the silence is worse than any sound could be. I woke this morning, another morning when I opened my eyes and felt that familiar moment of surprise that I still draw breath, and realized that I had not heard St. Giles's bell for 3 days running, not St. Botolph's either, nor any of the dozen church towers that used to mark our hours with their faithful bronze voices. At first I thought perhaps the pestilence had finally run its course, that there were simply no more dead to mourn. But when I ventured out into the street, such courage as that simple act now requires. I saw Thomas Whitmore's door still bearing its red cross, though I know he and his wife died a fortnight past, and the Carlisle house stands shuttered, with that terrible smell still seeping from its windows, though no searchers have come to remove the bodies within. No, sister, the dead are still with us. 'Tis the living who have grown scarce. I fear the bell-ringers themselves have joined the ranks of those they once commemorated. Poor old Samuel Fletcher, who rang for St. Giles these 30 years, took sick in September and was found in the bell tower, his hand still gripping the rope as if he died in the very act of announcing his own departure. Young Peter Mills, who assisted him, lasted only a week longer. Who is left to ring the bells now? Who remains to mark the passing of souls with that ancient music of mourning? The silence, Dorothy, I cannot make you understand how complete it is, how it presses against the ears like a weight. London was never a quiet city in all the years we lived here together. Do you remember how we used to complain of the din? The vendors crying their wares, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the arguments and laughter spilling from taverns, the church bells marking matins and vespers, and every death in between. Now I walk through streets where the only sounds are my own footsteps echoing off empty houses, and the occasional scurrying of rats grown bold in their dominion over the abandoned city. Even the dogs have gone silent. Those few that remain, poor things, seem to have learned that making noise draws no help, brings no comfort, serves no purpose in this kingdom of the dead. Yesterday, I passed the Crossed Keys Tavern, where Master Hopkins used to hold court every evening, entertaining his patrons with tales and songs and loud opinions about everything from the king's policies to the price of ale. The building stands now with its windows dark, its door hanging askew on broken hinges. Through the gap I glimpsed overturned stools and tables thick with dust, a single pewter tankard gleaming on the floor like a monument to revelry lost. The silence inside that place was so profound I could hear my own heartbeat, could count the rhythm of my breathing as if I were the only living thing in all the world. Perhaps I am becoming fanciful in my dotage, though at 68 I had not thought myself so very old until this year made me feel ancient beyond measure. But walking these empty streets, I sometimes feel more like a ghost than the living woman I suppose I still am. We survivors, and there are so few of us left, we move through this hushed city like specters ourselves, pale and silent, and half convinced we must be dead without knowing it. Mrs. Pemberton, who lives 3 houses down, speaks to me when our paths cross, but her voice has grown so weak and whispery that I strain to hear her words. She tells me she dreams each night that she has died and been sent to some strange purgatory where she must walk forever through empty streets, searching for people who are no longer there to be found. Perhaps, she said to me yesterday, her eyes bright with fever or madness, perhaps we are all dead, Goodwife Turner, and this silence is the first sound of eternity. I laughed when she said it, or tried to laugh, though the sound came out more like a sob. But later, lying in my bed in the deep hours of night, I wondered if there might not be some truth in her fanciful notion. For surely the London we once knew has died, and we who remain are but lingering spirits haunting the corpse of our former life. Do you remember, sister, how our street used to sound on Sunday mornings? The Hartwell children racing to church while their mother called after them to mind their Sunday clothes. Master Joinson practicing his sermon in his garden, his deep voice carrying over the walls as he rehearsed the words he would speak from the pulpit. The flower seller, with her sweet voice calling, "Violets, fresh violets," even though it was the Sabbath and she ought not to have been working. All gone now. The Hartwells dead, everyone. Master Joynson carried off in August. The flower seller, whose name I never learned, though I bought posies from her for 20 years, found in the lane behind Moorgate, with her basket still clutched in her stiffened fingers. Their voices, which once seemed such a natural part of our daily music, have joined that great silence that has settled over London like snow, muffling everything, making even memory seem distant and unreal. I have taken to speaking aloud to myself as I go about my daily tasks, just to hear a human voice in this quiet world. "Now, Margaret," I say, for even to myself I use my proper name, as if the formality might keep me tethered to some semblance of normal life. "Now, Margaret, you must check the fire and see if the pot wants stirring." The sound of my own voice in the empty kitchen is both comfort and reproach. Comfort, because it proves I still exist, still have some small power to break the silence that threatens to swallow all traces of human presence. Reproach, because it reminds me how far I have fallen from the woman who once shared conversation and laughter with a house full of family and friends. Do you know what I miss most, Dorothy? Not the grand sounds, not the church bells, or the market cries, or the music from the taverns. What I miss most are the small, intimate sounds of people living their lives close together. The murmur of voices through thin walls, the creak of floorboards as neighbors moved about their morning routines, the sound of children's laughter drifting through windows on summer evenings, the sounds that meant I was not alone in the world. Now, my neighbors' houses stand empty, their windows like blind eyes, their chimneys cold. When I look out my casement at evening, I see no candles flickering in other windows, no shadows of people moving about their business. Just darkness, as if the plague had not merely killed the inhabitants, but had extinguished the very idea of human habitation. Sometimes I light extra candles just to make my own windows bright, hoping that if any other survivors see the light, they might know they are not the only souls left alive on Silver Street. But no answering lights appear, no voices call across the darkness to share the comfort of mutual existence. I am become like a lighthouse keeper on some desolate coast, maintaining my beacon not because ships will come, but because the light itself is proof against the overwhelming darkness. The practical matters of survival grow stranger each day. I have food enough, taken from abandoned houses whose owners no longer have need of earthly sustenance. 'Tis an odd thing, Dorothy, to walk into a neighbor's kitchen and help myself to their stores, knowing they will never return to miss what I have taken. I say little prayers over each borrowed meal, asking forgiveness from the dead for my trespass, promising to use their provisions well and waste nothing. But eating alone in my kitchen, with no conversation to season the bread, no familiar voices to make the simple act of supper feel like communion rather than mere animal necessity. It scarce seems like living at all. I have tried keeping a cat for company, but even the cat seemed changed by this plague year. The one that adopted me, a gray tom with white paws who appeared at my door in October, is friendly enough, but he has a wariness about him that I have never seen in house cats before. He starts at sudden sounds, sleeps with one eye open, and sometimes stares at empty corners as if he sees things I cannot perceive. Perhaps he does. Perhaps animals understand something about this transformed world that we survivors have yet to grasp. The strangest thing is how my body has adapted to the silence. In the early days, when the bells still rang and some semblance of normal life persisted, I found the quiet intervals peaceful, even pleasant, a chance to hear myself think, to enjoy the luxury of undisturbed contemplation. But now, after months of this profound silence, my ears have grown hungry for sound in ways I never imagined possible. I strain to catch the faintest noises, the whisper of wind through broken shutters, the distant cry of carrion birds, the soft scurrying of mice in the walls. These tiny sounds, which I would never have noticed in the busy London of before, now seem precious as music. Yesterday, I heard a woman singing somewhere in the distance, just a few notes of an old ballad carried on the wind, and I wept with gratitude for that brief reminder that somewhere in this silent city, another human throat still shaped melody, another heart still found reason for song. I followed the sound through winding streets, past shuttered shops and abandoned houses, hoping to find the singer and perhaps share a moment's conversation with another survivor. But the voice faded before I could locate its source, leaving me standing alone in Cheapside with tears streaming down my cheeks and my ears straining after notes that had already melted back into the great quiet. Perhaps she was another ghost, another spirit like myself, condemned to wander these empty streets in search of the living world we once knew. Or perhaps she was real, and I simply lacked the skill to track voices through this maze of silence, having lost the art of following sounds that was once as natural as breathing. I think often of the London we shared in our youth, Dorothy, when we first came here as young wives, full of hope and excitement about city life. Do you remember how overwhelming it seemed at first? The constant noise, the press of crowds, the way one could scarce hear oneself speak for all the clamor of commerce and conversation. We learned to love it, though, didn't we? Learned to find music in the chaos, to take comfort in the proof that thousands of souls lived and worked and laughed and mourned within these walls. Even the quarrels and disturbances that used to annoy us, they were signs of life, evidence of human passion and engagement with the world. Now, I would give anything to hear just one good, loud quarrel between neighbors, to listen to merchants haggling over prices, to endure the singing of drunkards staggering home from taverns, to be waked at dawn by the cries of early vendors beginning their daily rounds. I would welcome any sound that proved London still lived, still breathed, still pulsed with the heartbeat of human community. But perhaps, and here I dare to hope, sister, though hope has been a dangerous indulgence this terrible year, perhaps the silence is not permanent. Perhaps it is merely winter's sleep, the quiet that comes before rebirth. I have heard rumors that the pestilence grows weaker, that fewer new victims are found each day. Master Richardson, who brings news from other quarters when he makes his weekly rounds collecting the dead, tells me that some parishes report no new cases for days at a time. If this be true, if the worst is truly past, then perhaps spring will bring new voices to fill our empty streets. Perhaps survivors will emerge from their hiding places like animals after a hard winter, blinking in the light, ready to begin the work of rebuilding what was lost. Perhaps the bells will ring again, not for the dead this time, but for the living, for marriages and births and feast days, for all the celebrations that make life worth preserving through the darkest times. I try to imagine it, Dorothy. London alive again, voices calling across the markets, children playing in the lanes, the warm murmur of conversation spilling from doorways and windows, the blessed, ordinary sounds of people living their lives in the company of other people. When I close my eyes and concentrate, I can almost hear it, almost believe that the silence is temporary, that the emptiness will fill again with human warmth and noise and all the chaotic music of community. But then I open my eyes and the quiet rushes back, and I remember that I am 68 years old and may not live to see London's resurrection even if it comes. I remember that most of the people who might return to fill these empty spaces are already dead, their voices stilled forever, their particular notes in the great song of the city lost beyond recovery. Still, for the sake of those who might yet survive, for the possibility that some remnant of our former life might be preserved and passed on, I continue to tend my small light in this darkness. I continue to speak aloud, to sing when I can manage it, to make whatever sounds I can produce to prove that silence has not yet conquered everything. And I write letters like this one, though I know not if they will ever find their way to living eyes. Perhaps someday, when London lives again, someone will discover these words and learn that in the great quiet of 1666, at least one voice refused to be stilled, at least one heart continued to beat with love for the absent and hope for the future. The bells may have stopped ringing for the dead, but in my heart they ring still for the living, for you, for all who yet draw breath, for the hope that silence is not the final word in this story we call life. With all my love and what remains of my faith, your sister Margaret.